Do you have to do a huge amount of scientific research or historical analysis to determine whether the story of Genesis in the Bible is factual? No, not at all. All you have to do is read the story of Genesis itself, and you will see its very words debunk its own tale. Stay tuned and I'll tell you why. The greatest amount of disbelief you can have when debating an evangelical or other Christian fundamentalist is when they defend the literal truth of the book of Genesis, when they conclude that every bit of it is factual, even though when all the evidence from every single genre of science clearly shows that the book of Genesis in the Bible was nothing more than a myth. Now, in the old days, when they would say something ridiculous, you would have to go to the library or a bookstore to refute their nonsensical claim. The information wasn't right on hand instantly through your iPhone and Google. Even so, with this modern technology for research, I still had to spend a very significant amount of time to conclusively and factually debunk their so-called scientifically evidenced claims that prove that the book of Genesis was literal and factual and really occurred, even though my basic common sense already knew that I was right and they were wrong. For their belief system in Genesis isn't much more valid than when someone believes that the earth is flat, and the flat earthers will try to present their evidence as well to prove their worldview. But that is the level of ridiculousness a Christian fundamentalist has in his psyche. When John Baumgartner explained that all the animals were once on the same supercontinent, therefore all easily able to walk to the location of Noah's Ark to board it, because his theory of runaway subduction explained how the continents drifted apart across the earth in 40 days and 40 nights after the flood began, I had to actually look up what runaway subduction meant. I had to study it, and then I had to read all the other scientists to understand why Baumgartner's hypothesis was so ridiculous to begin with. But you know what? You don't have to engage in a bunch of research to prove that Genesis is fictional when debating a Christian fundamentalist type, for the book of Genesis debunks itself. The simple reading of the basic English translation, regardless of version, negates the creation story from the get-go, and doesn't do much to establish believability with the story of Abraham either. As a matter of fact, you're not even 10 lines into the first chapter before the factual basis of the story basically nullifies itself. You don't think so, Christian fundamentalist? Let's take a look. In the beginning, verse 1, God created the heavens and the earth. Talks about the earth being a formless void and darkness covering the face, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters, verse 2. Verse 3, God said, "Let there be light," hence there was light. Then in 4, God said that the light was good, so God separated the light from the darkness. And in verse 5, God called the light day, and he called the darkness night. And there was evening and morning, the first day. So we're 5 verses in, and already we have an irreconcilable contradiction. Why was there darkness and light, and night and day, and evening and morning, when there was no sun? Because it takes until verse 16 before God made the 2 great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. And this is interesting because a few lines later, the book claims there was evening and morning once again, the 4th day. And this is where the fundamentalist comes up with his maybe God did arguments. In other words, there's no reasonable explanation whatsoever. The verses completely contradict any form of reality whatsoever. So now we have to come up with hypotheses of what God actually did versus what he clearly said he did in the Bible that you say is the literal word of God. You'll say maybe God was controlling the light and darkness before the 4th day. Maybe God decided to create a sun to do it for him. Maybe this, maybe that. But the fact is, you claim the book of Genesis is the inerrant story of creation. But this proves it's not, because in the first few verses you have a morning and an evening, and there's no sunrise or sunset. This is why there's such a debate on what the Hebrew word yom meant. Did it mean day or sequence of time? And yes, I have read the many scholars that conclude because of the numerical detonations with the word that it had to mean 24-hour period. But there's also schools of thought that say that can't be because of the simple fact that there's no sun. I'm sure whoever wrote this did not understand the millions upon millions of years it would have taken to create the earth But how can you possibly argue that light occurred, darkness occurred, morning occurred, evening occurred, all classified as a day, but there was no sun? Because you are a cult member, that's why. Not to mention, in chapter 1, verse 16, when God did make the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night, then he says he made the stars. Did God not understand that the sun is a star? Now, the ancient person who wrote this book would not have known this. He would have believed the stars are one entity and the sun is an entirely different entity. God would have said he created the stars, one of them being the great light to rule the day on our planet. There is no arguing your way out of this, Christian fundamentalist. You believing in this is fanatical absurdity. But the story of Genesis only gets more unreasonable. We know that Adam and Eve initially had two children, Cain and Abel, and we know that Cain supposedly slew Abel. Then the Lord put a mark on Cain, as he was cast out to be a forever wanderer, the mark a sign that no one should kill him, so he can endure his punishment while roaming earth. Well, who was exactly going to kill him? Nobody has been created except his family. Where exactly were these other populations that God was worried about? Because the only people that exist at that point are Adam, Eve, and Cain. But yet, someone magically appears as you continue to read Genesis chapter 4, when it talks about Cain making love to his wife, which results in the son Enoch. This is one we all know. Where did Cain's wife come from? And I've actually had an evangelical suggest that the wife was Eve, which completely disregards not only the laws of adultery, but incest as well, which are forbidden in later parts of the Bible. My evangelical friend decided that since we were now destined to live in sin, due to the believability of a talking snake that tricked the first two humans, God made a scenario where we had to have incest to procreate, to continue living in that sin in which we were now destined. That's how ludicrous an evangelical mindset actually is. Because a passage says Cain made love to his wife. If that wife was Eve, wouldn't the passage say he made love to his mother? It can't be his wife because it's Adam's wife. And it can't be another woman because no other woman has been created yet. There is no way you can reconcile this, Christian fundamentalist. And let's briefly look at the chapter 11 in Genesis, the very first verse, where it states the world had one common language. The problem is we know there wasn't just one language. That passage simply isn't true. Then in Genesis 16, Abraham sleeps with Hagar, who is an Egyptian slave, in order for him to have a son. And then only later, well into Sarai's elderly years, does God give Abraham a son through his own wife. So 1, God seems perfectly okay with slavery. 2, he's absolutely fine with adultery, even though that's forbidden in one of those things known as the 10 Commandments. And 3, why didn't he just give him a son through Sarai to begin with? Your story of Genesis is literally contradicting laws dropped down in later books of the Bible, supposedly directed from God himself. Therefore, God has dementia and doesn't realize what laws he's propagated, or your story of Genesis is nothing more than just a mere fable. And note, I did this without one shred of research. I simply read Genesis again, and I didn't have to debunk it. It debunks itself. And this, Christian evangelical and fundamentalist, is why I can so easily debunk you. I have an entire playlist debunking Genesis, where I research your so-called scientists' findings from the Institute of Creation Research and prior historical writings from other cultures that many times mimic Genesis, but I don't even have to do that. The book debunks itself. But if you're still not convinced, here is the end card that takes you to that playlist, where I one by one chop your so-called evidence to bits. And I'll see you next time as we once again take that sword of reason and reality and thrust it right through the heart of ignorance.